Hello, friends. It's Chapo.
You had it all happening, reading the news from Mexico. This kind of, actually, it's interesting. There's a lot of Vietnam era scholarship on Mexico that is like interested in playing with those comparisons between the U.S. and Vietnam. And in a lot of ways, there's something about the war with Mexico that feels more 20th century than a lot of these other conflicts. It both in the kind of skullduggery and the conspiracy that started, the sort of the dark cabals inside Washington, and then in the sort of just brazenly imperial conduct of the war, where which involve this really massive undertaking, sending, by the time, you have Taylor in Mexico, and I don't, maybe we want to get further into this, but by the time Winfield Scott is doing an amphibious landing in Veracruz, they're bombarding with a huge flotilla. They're bombarding the city of Veracruz. Then he marches all the way up, following Cortez's footsteps into Mexico City. Meanwhile, you have the U.S. Navy active in the Pacific, seizing California, marching through to New Mexico. It's an absolutely massive thing that, even though it's dwarfed by the scale of the Civil War, the kind of overseas projection of power is it's really striking and coinciding with a lot of these media phenomenon where people are following the war at home. There are, unlike Vietnam, the protesters, or at least maybe like the beginning of Vietnam, but the U.S. never really had a Palo Alto in Vietnam. You had massive bonfires and parades and, brass bands celebrating, Cerro Gordo, the heroes of Resaca de Palma, and it was just a sort of this mass phenomenon that, especially in that first year of the war, really drove forward, muted this Whig opposition, which was forceful at times, got the money for the war and ensured its ultimate successful prosecution.
Even in the face of the fact that the army that was supposed to carry out this invasion was undermanned, underfunded antebellum military in the time when democratic was not going to accede to the building of a significant standing army, and early struggles to try to get it into the field.
Yeah, they had a horrible time with supplies. I mean, I think the Mexican army I read is about 25,000 when the war started, and the U.S. Army is 13,000. So the standing army doesn't really exist for all intents and purposes, and they have to create it. It is though. I mean, I will say, just skimming this stuff again, it does have echoes of all this America at war, both incredible FUBAR, supply chain issues, and yet underneath it, this kind of incredible productive capacity, which was already visible in the 1840s, in the sense that they can shoot out 100 firearms out of the early northeastern manufacturing centers, where gun manufacture is one of the first really heavy industries in the U.S. There are some things that they struggle to get out, but the mills of Massachusetts are firing out shoes, like 12,000 shoes a month for these soldiers, for Winfield Scott's army. So even though, they're getting there by like wagon over this shitty, swampland, or, stagnant on sailing vessels in the Gulf or whatever, it's incredibly fucked up. But there's this tension between, incompetence, laughable incompetence in many cases, and this sort of, I wouldn't say awe-inspiring, maybe more like fear-inspiring, but it's just this kind of abundant power of the hints of which are being just beginning to be seen. I mean, obviously this is way before real industrialization, but you have, in key articles of war, shoes and guns are up there, and the Northeast was already doing that.
Yeah, and we see, yes, the emergence of a pattern that's going to be deepened over time, where America has this nascent capacity, or this often untapped capacity, that really only ever gets brought into full being by the war, and essentially by the extra constitutional space that's sort of created by war fighting, by the need to overlook niceties and the chains of the chains of legality that bind the state otherwise, to our constitutional order. And at every point, it's a war that just bursts forth, reveals new capacities, and then in the aftermath, has these new things that are now permanent fixtures of the American economy and political world.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. It's like we had this recent rerun of it, where you had a pretty spectacular galvanizing event, but it didn't produce what a war would have produced, with COVID anyway.
Yeah, that's the thing. If there's nobody to give a gun to, it's no use.
Yeah, not the same kind of mobilization. I mean, this is going far afield, but it's a question whether our sort of little imperial wars have that impact anymore either, because it's also kind of off stage and managed in a different way. And Mexico is interesting in that way. To try to bring it back to that, I guess it's both a kind of small standing army that didn't have it wasn't like they instituted this huge draft that reached into the heart of the nation and transformed it. But you did have a mass volunteer experience, at least especially in like the Midwest and the South, where you had, huge numbers of volunteers signing up for this war and following the war, being engaged in the war. It really did produce on the kind of cultural and media levels, that kind of galvanizing energy that, you see only in later wars, nowhere else.
And among those people who were at least partially galvanized, that you mentioned earlier, and I found this fascinating, the Mormons. This is the precise period when the Mormons are in the process of moving out to their imagined Zion in Utah after Joseph Smith has been shot down like a dog. But in order to gain federal support for their westward migration, Brigham Young has a Mormon battalion drawn up that ends up marching from Iowa to San Diego over the course of the war. And,
hell of a road trip.
Yeah, I mean, pretty impressive.
Hell of a hike.
Yeah. At one point, they bump into the Donner Party. People who get discharged from it end up being amongst the first people to discover gold at Sutter's Mill. It's definitely a sort of a Forrest Gumpian journey for the men of the Mormon battalion there.
I wonder if there was a Mormon Bilbo who rode there and back again from his little dwelling in Iowa.
Yes. Yeah. But yeah, so that just goes to show how it becomes this national. It really does become a national campaign and there's nothing we love more than kicking the shit out of another country, and it makes us remember why we're in this in the first place.
Yeah, I suppose.
But I'd like to talk a little bit about one of the figures of incompetence that sort of it spoils the broth a little bit. It's also the guy who is credited with making the war happen in the first place, President Polk, because his management of the war it's micromanaging, it's deeply politicized.
Yeah.
And it also includes a hilarious sort of sealed train to Finland Station thing with Santa Anna that ends up prolonging the war significantly.
Totally. Yeah, no, it's interesting. Well, yeah, because Polk, you have a, antebellum republic where the warmongers are Democrats and the war personnel are Whigs,
Right. Yeah. Winfield Scott, famously, yes.
So all the generals,
and Zachary
Taylor, Winfield Scott, several others at the top of the military brass are either Whig, either like actual sort of on the red line Whig, or just vaguely Whiggish. That's Robert E. Lee, for instance, who's gets his spurs, serving under Scott. And basically there's a profound distrust between that sort of Whiggish army elite and the sort of West Point brass and
the deep state, if you will.
Yeah, exactly. The 1846 deep state, which didn't, Polk was trying to drain that swamp, and so he's trying to promote. I mean, there is a Trumpian element to this. He's trying. He works hard to like try to get his Democratic generals in there. I mean, this is an element of like that also you can find in every American war. Certainly the Civil War, there were plenty of political generals. There will always be political generals, but there are some cartoonish ones where Polk appoints. I think Gideon. I think is it? Does he actually appoint? I think it's Gideon Pillow, who later had a fort named after him, where black troops are murdered during the Civil War. He's just a total Democrat bumpkin who bombs when he's deployed. You had Franklin Pierce, actually, later U.S. president, was a kind of political general from New Hampshire who got there via Democratic Party connections.
He traveled from battle to battle in a barrel of tequila.
I think the only action he saw, they said, was when he fell off his horse. The hero of many bottles. But so these Whig generals, so there's a lot of friction, there's a lot of static between the Polk administration, Secretary of War Marcy, Secretary of State Buchanan, all these Democratic kind of, you can't really say they're fighting the deep state because they are the ruling, kind of administrative personnel of DC, even though they also kind of hate administration. But anyway, all of these apparatchiks are there, and the generals, are, and these Whig generals are vain and grandstanding in very different ways. Taylor is rumpled and kind of gritty, but totally stubborn and, obsessed with his own ideas about what to do, constantly, sort of improvising and, sort of he captures Monterey and he offers this very generous armistice, and Polk's pissed about that. But none of the guys in Washington really know what the situation is like on the ground, and the communications aren't that good. And then on the higher political level, what you talk about, it's amazing. So they're trying to figure out, they don't really want to conquer. Polk doesn't actually want to do a full scale. There are factions in the Democratic Party that do. I don't think Polk is one of them. Want a full scale conquest of Mexico. There is an all Mexico movement and so on. But I think the kind of majority of Democrats want something like actually Calhoun's formula, even though he doesn't get along with Polk either, which is, loosely stated, the maximum of Mexico and the minimum of Mexicans, which is, so in their eyes, basically the borders that we got, the Rio Grande west to California. Sometimes they want Baja California. Sometimes, the border is a bit farther north and it's just, San Francisco Bay and downward. There's some interesting counterfactuals there, although I kind of feel like the U.S. was coming for San Diego and Los Angeles anyway. But anyway, so in other words, the big strategic issue for the Americans when the war starts is, how do we compel a peace from Mexico? So Polk kind of Taylor kind of meanders into northern Mexico towards Monterey, fights a couple battles, pushes the Mexican army back, takes Monterey, and then kind of just sits there, because at that point he's got to march another hundreds and hundreds of miles to get to even the next significant strategic point. His supply lines are already in ribbons. And it's not really clear. The Mexican government is showing no signs of coming to the negotiating table. So meanwhile, you have this on again, off again hero villain of Mexican politics, Santa Anna, who's been in bed with the conservatives, who's been in bed with the liberals, currently out of power, kind of chilling in Havana. And he's sending his emissaries to Polk saying, hey, let me in, I'll make a peace. So the U.S. government basically does, exactly what the Bolsheviks did. I mean, what the Imperial Germany did in the First World War, where they're like, hey, let's send all the agitators, let's send all of the troublemakers and the potential peacemakers to the internal enemies of the state, to our opposing parties. So they send all the Bolsheviks back, across the front to Russia to help bring down the regime, which works. And the U.S. did the same with Santa Anna. There's actually some good comedy about, or mildly good comedy there. He's in Havana, and they send a U.S. naval commander. I mean, it's secret diplomacy, because it's like, what they're doing is trying to install a puppet who's the most famous political leader of the era. So it's kind of hard to do it covertly, but they don't do it very well. This naval commander, who's actually famous for putting down the only mutiny in U.S. naval history, which Melville wrote his story Billy Budd about. This guy, Alexander Slidell Mackenzie, total hard ass. He just hires a coach in Havana in full dress uniform and goes up to Santa Anna's house and is like, okay, here are the conditions. We'll bring you to Mexico and you'll take over and you'll sell us your territory, right? And Santa Anna's like, well, with the Texas border, why do you guys claim the Rio Grande again? That doesn't make any sense. And he's like, well, because we want it. And Santa Anna's like, all right, deal. And they put him on a British ship. And, the U.S. has this extensive blockade of the coast. The whole Navy is in the Gulf of Mexico. They just let Santa Anna waltz on through. And he shows up. And then, of course, he gets there. He's actually at this time sort of interesting, and I'd like to know more about this. He makes an alliance with the kind of most ultra-liberal of the Mexicans, this guy Gomez Farias, who is the most sort of decentralized, very anti-clerical, very kind of Enlightenment liberal, but also kind of a populist figure in that way that, liberal populism was a thing in Mexico, kind of the masses rather than the grandes and the church leaders. Santa Anna, Gomez Farias is like ruling in Mexico City, and Santa Anna goes to the front. It's like, you fight, I'll govern. There's actually Gomez Farias is interesting. Hopefully you'll get somebody on the pod who knows more about the Mexican history, because that's an interesting combo. I mean, obviously Santa Anna is a total opportunist and is doing anything he can to stay in power. And he resolves, not only does he welch on the deal, he summons the most extensive Mexican counterattack, really the only counterattack of the war. He leads a huge force against Taylor, and at Buena Vista, he gives him a hell of a fight. It's a really serious, bloody battle on both sides. Eventually, he's repulsed, but only after some serious hard fighting. And I don't want to say it really could have gone the other way, but the hundreds dead at Buena Vista are completely on James K. Polk for this Santa Ana intrigue.
Pobungler, we called him. But of course, we must stress that, yes, there's some heavy fighting, some pitched battles, but the vast majority of troops died of crapping themselves. As was true in the Civil War, it would be true in most wars until the antibiotic revolution. The most common way you're going to die in the American army of the Mexican War is shitting in a ditch.
Second most common, probably in this case, was dying of yakking, of the vomito, the yellow fever,
yeah.
which comes in big in Veracruz. Yeah,
I'm always kind of amazed that they're able to get people to go fight in these wars, because the idea of dying in battle, I think, does have, for young men specifically, a certain romance, and it can get them out the door. I do wonder if they knew how much more likely they were to die shitting, how much they would have been willing to go to war for that. Because it does seem like it's very hard to imagine any romance.
It's true. You can't have a Call of Duty dysentery edition. That doesn't work. You're confined to your tent.
Press X to shit yourself again. Yeah. You're just banging on the button. Like, I remember you told me that that a Crispin was the first guy buried in Arlington.
Yes.
I was like, oh, cool. And I look it up. It's like dysentery. It's like, fuck.
Yeah, he was there like a month.
He couldn't have caught a Minet ball or something. He had to just be shitting.
Yeah. No, I think the conditions in Mexico are arguably even worse than. I guess it depends. Maybe some of the Confederates had it worse, but the U.S. Army in Mexico did a lot of occupying. It fought a few battles, and then it did a lot of depredations on the countryside. It did a lot of pillaging. It did a lot of there's plenty of atrocity stories. It did a lot of frisking of random frisking of priests and things like that. There's plenty of anti-Catholicism going on.
Which led to, in my mind, one of the most fascinating events in it, or really any American war, which is the defection of the Shamrock Battalion.
Yeah, amazing. Great stuff. You actually struggle to think about how this could work in any other war, but basically it's a group of 150-ish, mostly Irish Catholics who are in one way or another, conscripted or maybe sort of volunteered out of sheer poverty into the U.S. Army.
That was the number one motivator then as now. You couldn't get a Dodge Charger or a communications degree, but they would give you some hardtack and a place to sleep.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, you didn't even get health insurance then. The call was weaker. But anyway, yeah. So within weeks, so under these conditions, first of all, it must be said, the desertion rate is huge, especially in Taylor's army in northern Mexico, which does a lot of sitting around. And even in the early days, even after these kind of triumphant victories, the conditions are so miserable, and the whole thing is so sort of thinly policed and surveilled, and the American military sledgehammer touch. That is one significant difference. American wars in the 20th century, if you were doing this kind of huge imperial overseas effort, you have just the bureaucrats that go along with the army, the guys in the rear with the gear. You really didn't have much of that. That was the problem. They didn't have enough gear, and as a result, it was a lot easier to slip away. So of these deserters, the most interesting are about 150 up to 200, mostly Irish Catholic, although some German immigrants were in there. I was looking at it. There were some Scots. There were a range of deserters, one or two African Americans, who are in the region, working in some capacity with the army, who slip over to and sign up as a brigade to fight for the Mexicans under as the St. Patrick's, but the San Patricio Battalion, as they say.
How'd they do?
And yeah, they fly. They have a shamrock flag, and the Kelly Green. There's this guy John Riley's their commander, and they fight like intensely. Every record I've read of this is like they were one of the most devoted units. A lot of the Mexican soldiers, they're completely conscripted peasants who have almost no stake in this war. Maybe they hate the Yankees, but they're also involved in, they hate the centralists just as much. They hate various factions of American politics, local politics. They hate their local grande. They hate their neighbor. Not very political, not very committed to the war, and so don't always offer the most determined resistance. Same thing with the officer class, frankly, in the Mexican army, very erratic. And the San Patricios have a stake somehow in this. And yeah, I was reading at Churubusco, which is one of the bloodier engagements in the Scots campaign towards Mexico City. The officer kill rate in the American army is huge. And you have a sense that these guys are actually just aiming to kill American officers in combat with the Shamrock Brigade. So in the end, it's not really a happy ending. They mostly get captured, and there's 50 of them are hung up and executed by the U.S. Army. It's the largest mass execution in U.S. history. Not the Lakota that were hung in the Dakota War during the Civil War, the largest one-off. But all these guys were hung over the course of a couple days as part of one unit, tried and won as a body. It's pretty grim, but the penalty for desertion in wartime was death.
It's true. You got to figure that phenomenon would have been a nice back pocket propaganda for the nativists in America. Like these guys literally gave them guns and they literally just ran away and joined the Mexicans.
They would. I mean,
because they love the Pope so goddamn much.
They do. I mean, I think there were it's hard to know whether it was just desperation or kind of, tedium or a genuine kind of Catholic sense of, oppressed nation under the power of this arrogant Anglo-Saxon, dominator. It's hard to say. It is kind of funny to imagine versions of this in other wars. Like imagine like 150 U.S. soldiers slipping away to join like the Republican Guard and become like the most determined outposts of like Baathism in 2003. That would have been interesting.
Yeah, 2, 3 many John Walker Lynns. That would have been great.
Like, yeah.
A Taliban unit of pissed off American teenagers.
Yeah, that's what you would have needed. You would have needed like basically the Grey Wolf Brigade. That it'd be ripe for recruitment, especially if Felix offered to lead like a Baathist. I think the religious stuff is harder because there isn't that connection. But if you have some sort of vague secular nationalist thing that's like anti-American, it really, I actually can see Baathism having a kind of ideological lure over disaffected, Zoomers and millennials.
I mean, if my perusal of memes tells me anything, it's that is absolutely true. Yeah. There's definitely a Baath appeal that could have been made. If Saddam had put more money into PSYOPs, he might have been able to get some sort of fifth column going of people.
Yeah, I got the what's his name
shooting the like gold-plated AKs. Like, come on, that's cooler than George W. Bush any day of the week.
Like what would you call it? Like the Nasser Brigade or I don't know what like who's the who was Baghdad Bob? What was his name? The propaganda minister. Do you guys remember?
I just remember them calling him Baghdad Bob.
Yeah, I know exactly.
Mohammed Saeed al-Saf.
Okay. All right. Anyway, but yeah, they should have.
See, I don't think they could have named it after him because he was cringe.
Yeah, he was cringe. Fun of him
for not telling the
Sons. The Sons.
Uday and Kusei. Now we're talking.
Yeah.
Those guys. There's some charisma.
The Uday Kusei Brigade. The UQers.
Yeah.
Everyone remembers. We could just write that Wikipedia entry now, and who would know? The UQers, disaffected youths from Louisville and
America's suburbs,
Appleton, Wisconsin.
Yeah.
Anyway, but this really happened in the war with Mexico, and it is notable. I mean, it's a reminder alongside the Mormon stuff of like kind of how, if you will, like ethnically, religiously chaotic this landscape of 19th century North America was, where all sorts of weird alliances and configurations were possible. It's like the same thing with the Fenians in the Civil War, where you have Confederates teaming up with them in Canada to like rob banks in Vermont and so on, and cause trouble for the Union Army on the basis of some kind of anti-U.S. government, anti-Anglo alliance. You have a lot of, especially on the margins, which is, in fairness, most of the continent at this point, you have a lot of possibilities for different sorts of permutations than our kind of strict, ideological a sort of simplified register of just like America's march over the continent would have you think.
So obviously you had the Shamrock guys being deeply disillusioned by their part of the war, but then also they're also not happy about it, but also not unhappy enough to do anything about it. We have U.S. Grant, one of many future Civil War figures who cut their teeth in the Mexican War, and who afterwards
heroics.
He was doing what?
He was doing heroics too, Grant. I mean, he wasn't. I mean, Robert E. Lee was like sneaking across the desert to set up a cannon. Grant was like riding horses, like 2 horses, 1 on each leg. Kind of doing. He was doing like Chinese martial arts stuff.
He was doing wire fu. Yeah.
in combat in I think he was also in the Scott Army. Or was he in Taylor's army? I can't remember. Anyway, he saw intense action.
And after the war, he claimed that there was never a more wicked war than that waged by the United States on Mexico. And he said that at the time I thought it then, but I had not the moral courage enough to resign. That's what he said. Also, he had no other skills or idea on what to do with himself.
We saw what happened to him after he did resign, or rather was edged,
gently shown the door of the tent.
Gently shown the door of the tent.
Yeah,
he was a drunken saddle maker, or a drunken leather worker in Galena. Yeah.
I mean, his reputation for being drunk mostly stems from the period after the war when he was manning those posts in California, and there's like nobody there. Like if you don't have a smartphone, the 19th century version of that would have been a bottle of whiskey.
Yeah,
there's nothing else to do.
Yeah, there's not even true. He didn't. There was just nothing. I mean, I guess you could go out. I mean, the other thing that was available was murdering indigenous inhabitants.
That's it. That wasn't much fun. It's too squeamish.
Yeah, that wasn't Grant's thing. But yeah, there wasn't a lot. There wasn't a lot. Yeah, I don't think it's true. I shouldn't slander one of the greats in Galena. I think he was actually relatively sober. Just a total failure.
Shitty.
Of business. Yeah, just shitty.
He couldn't even blame the alcohol for being bad at saddle making.
Just kind of clinging to his father-in-law's like modest largesse. Yeah, that's it.
So who else we got coming up there? Who else is in the Mexican War? Who ends up showing up?
Beauregard's there. Beauregard was there. A lot of the B grade guys. I'm actually trying to remember. I should know this. I don't think McClellan was there. He's too young.
Yeah, he was.
I should know this better. Was Sherman there?
That's a good question.
This is where I didn't hit all these guys. There's books written on this.
He did not see action. No, he was in Northern California.
Okay. Yeah, because I don't have
he was dicking around in the Bay Area, apparently.
But yeah, a lot of the kind of like division commanders and stuff, a lot of the top brass, mostly underneath Taylor and Scott, they were kind of the aged. It was that same sort of Winfield Scott role, that aged generation that was kind of loosely pushed out right at the war began. Like this guy, David Twiggs, who was one of the important commanders was a Georgian who was in Texas in 1860 and was the big commander in Texas who just gave all where there was actually some unionist sentiment and a unionist governor, Sam Houston, in 1861.